This is Sonic Ventures, a podcast celebrating the concept album format with Robert Goebel and Joël Tibbetts.
Sonic Ventures is an evolving series of discussions that explore concept albums from a variety of artists and genres. Our intent here is to have celebratory conversations of our personal experiences with selected works and the issues and themes surrounding concept albums.
Sometimes, we will be treading familiar waters concerning music interpretation and creation. Other times, we will venture into different places of thought, emotion, and expression. We invite you to join us on our sonic venture. Joël here, and welcome to the Sonic Ventures podcast, Season 2, Episode 7. In this episode, we discussed Tyler the Creator's 2019 concept album, Igor. This conversation was recorded on August 4th, 2023. Now, I didn't want to take up too much time saying much of anything about this conversation because actually, this is a very unique episode in the podcast canon that we've been developing over the last couple of years. It's unique in what we talked about, but it's also very unique in why we're talking about this album. So I'm not going to say anything about that. But what I wanted to do is share with you an experience I had a couple days after we recorded the episode. Now, generally, I'm the one who does the nice little touch-ups of edits wherever they may be required so that you, the listener, can have a smooth, comfortable journey through our conversation. And generally what I do is that after we record an episode, the next day, I don't do anything related to the podcast. I don't think about it. I don't do any editing, nothing. So that way I kind of have something of a clean slate in mind as I go back and listen to the episode and revisit the conversation. And when I did that for this particular episode, I got about halfway through it when an image came to mind. Basically what happened is I saw a very large roll of papyrus paper unfurled in front of me on a desktop. And looking at the paper, I noticed that the bottom left corner had drawings on it. And looking closer, they were geographical. There were shoreline, there were rivers, there were mountains. And as I continued to listen to the episode, I saw a hand add to those features, draw more of the shoreline, draw more rivers. And as this happened, I noticed that the piece of paper upon which these images were being drawn was growing. As I continued to listen and watch this image evolve in front of me, as more geography was drawn, the paper got larger. What I was left with this image was that it symbolized what is not only happening for me with this podcast and the process of listening to these albums and having these conversations, that it's reflective of my relationship with learning about and having music in my life. That for everything that I may add to my knowledge, my experience, my understanding, the area in which I can explore of music history, of music technology, and just sharing music with other people, itself keeps growing. So, at a younger time in my life, I would have maybe found this a little discouraging because I'm never going to fill that piece of paper. I'm never going to be able to connect the lines. I'm never going to be able to really know the full features and depths that map can represent of the presence, scale, and influence that music has in my life and in people's lives in general. But at this time in my life, I find it to be very encouraging. I find it to be full of wonder, full of curiosity and creativity. And it actually compels me to seek more, to ask more, to wonder more, and to experience more. So in brief, I just wanted to pass this image on to all of you as it feels very pertinent to my journey with this podcast, with these conversations with Rob, and with expressing and extending the experience of music that we all may share. Now, having said that, Rob and I are always keen to hear from those of you who've listened to an episode and may have something you want to ask or share with us. So as always, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can reach us at sonicventurespodcast@gmail.com. And if you have been enjoying our podcast episodes, please feel free to check out our Patreon page where there's a lot more content. And without further ado, here's our conversation about Tyler, the Creator's album, Igor. Thanks for listening.
Hello, Joël. How you doing, man?
I'm very well. How are you?
Very good, too. Thanks for coming over today.
It's a pleasure to be in your studio space that's evolving. I see that it's slowly developing your personal touch and ergonomics of creative flow. So it's very nice to see it evolving.
Yeah, very, very slowly. I've prioritized all the important things like monitor stands and little woodshop projects because. But there we go.
It's starting to warm up really nice, and like I said, it's a pleasure to be a part of it evolving, seeing it evolve, and as always, it's a pleasure to get together to talk about another album. And this one is a very special, unique case for the podcast.
Absolutely it is, yeah.
It's our first time where we are talking about an album that was recommended to us by someone else. We didn't have this as a part of a list that we shared between one another to decide what we'd talk about. We actually had a very good friend and supporter of the podcast who, because they're a supporter of the podcast, in a few different ways, we asked them to suggest an album for us to talk about, and that's why today we are going to be talking about Tyler, the Creator's Igor.
Wow, yeah, that's great, and a big thank you to Josh.
Yes, it is Josh,
whose name's come up on the podcast before.
Yep,
and I'm sure will come up again. But it's a great thing. To be able to get not only feedback from folks, but to have their input into the process as well, because we don't live in a vacuum, even though sometimes you can bunker in and feel like you're,
Yeah. Well, and I think that we've actually been starting to get some response and interaction with people who've listened to the podcast that's quite new for us.
Yeah.
And I think that having an episode where we're talking about an album that was requested or suggested by someone who follows the podcast coincides with this shift we're starting to see. That's really exciting.
Yeah.
To hear about other people's experiences, their interests, and how perhaps the podcast relates to them. It's quite nice.
Yeah, and I'm not going to mention any names at this point because we haven't secured permission or asked permission to sort of see who we can talk about and what we can say. But the podcast is definitely going through a phase where we're reaching more people and we're getting engagement from folks in the audience. And some of the things that have come back to us have been absolutely wonderful.
Very much so.
Mind-blowing. Podcasts in and of themselves.
I think that's actually a really fair way to put it, because it's really interesting how we've been doing this podcast, how for ourselves there's this growing musical narrative and ecosystem because of the albums themselves we're talking about.
Yeah.
But as we start to hear from other people and they are engaging with us actually kind of in a way that we engage with each other on the podcast. This idea of sharing experience, sharing perspective, but then also sharing associations musically. Like if I listen to this, it makes me think about that, or I found myself going and listening to this music I wouldn't normally listen to. So I find it very exciting to not only hear from people about the music itself, but also engaging with people in ways that isn't just in little sound bites.
Yeah.
Like much more richer morsels and things that like I need time to digest. I can't just read it and then respond. I have to actually take time to think about it and to allow myself to invest myself in that exchange with that person.
Yeah, and some of that it has shaped the podcast itself. I mean, this podcast isn't 20 minutes. You know, it's 90 minutes plus or minus. Usually plus. And then, of course, you know, not satisfied with ending it there, we do another 90-minute one right after in the Aftercast. So for those of you that need more Sonic Ventures, the Aftercasts are all available on our Patreon site.
And that's actually how we are working the podcast right now, is that in terms of this, taking a suggestion for an album to talk about, it is related to anyone supporting us through the Patreon. You do have the possibility at the end of, well, will be next season, because we're almost finished our second season now.
Yeah.
So for just to think ahead to season 3, our plan is to have the last episode, second to last episode, whatever it may be, actually be an album that one of our Patreon subscribers has suggested.
Yeah, and the more engagement we get from folks, you know, the more they become part of the podcast, and we can't not but include them in this. You know, I like, again, we're not operating
however
in a vacuum
comfortable
here.
it is for them.
Yeah.
Just calling people randomly.
Yeah.
That would be a new show. What do you mean, why am I calling you? You wrote in, you said you liked our stuff. What's the problem?
Yeah.
Yeah. So of course, within certain parameters, but you're right. And that's I think how the podcast started for us, was that it was the camaraderie and the relational aspect of discussing music.
Yeah.
And I think that for both of us, we're very, I imagine for both of us, we're very pleased to have whatever expansion of that idea happens through the podcast.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so.
So.
Yeah, so that's our, we got to get back to the task at hand here. But so here we are.
With Igor, Tyler, the Creator's 2019 album.
Yeah.
And I would like to start off by saying that this album was actually previously recommended to me by Josh.
Right, just as a general recommendation.
So I had kind of a pre-preparation for this.
This was foreshadowed.
Yeah, very much so. And so he suggested it to me when we were doing our first season.
Yeah.
So we were about maybe 4 episodes in, so about halfway through. And he said, you got to check this out. I think this is a great album, and it's a concept album. So my first listen of this album was immediately in the context of our podcast.
Right.
In terms of, I mean, of course, I made short lists before, the albums I want to talk about. But when I started listening to this album, I decided that I'll only listen to it twice. And then that's it. And back then. So a year ago, I listened to it twice, immediately was very taken into it, very very curious about getting to know it better.
Yeah.
But also, I had already decided that I wanted to do this album.
Sure.
And so I just listened to it twice and then put it on the shelf, so to speak, until we had this moment of talking about it.
Yeah. And on that first listen, I mean, I'm going to make an assumption here, but my assumption is that this genre is not one that you're super familiar with, or possibly even familiar with in any sense. Would that be fair?
Well, it depends on what genre we're talking about, because if you consider it to be the Grammys, it's urban.
Right.
If you consider it in terms of Tyler, the Creator's view of it, it's pop.
Right.
So I would say that the areas in which this music gravitates for me is about, I guess you could say 30% on my radar.
Okay.
And I mean, because I listen to lots of different types of music. For those of you who've heard us talk about this kind of thing on the podcast, you probably know that I listen to lots of different stuff. So an album like this wouldn't necessarily be on a regular rotation for me unless it really, really pops for me.
Okay.
But in terms of, like, if we're talking about hip hop, if we're talking about rap, it's a form of music that I find myself going to. Well, before we were doing the podcast, I found myself going to that dependent on who I'm engaging with musically, and just where I am in my life. I would say that it's something that I explore a couple of times a year on my own. So yeah, like, I don't consider myself a hip hop aficionado at all. I do really, really love a lot of the ways in which hip hop music is created, and pop music for that matter too, which is way more general. I think it's a far more general connotation for a style of music. But yeah, when I was like, even when we did Deltron 3030, there was areas of hip hop that I hadn't really engaged with. So for this album, for example, horrorcore was still kind of new to me.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say that it's not hip hop, is not my number one. What's the word I'm looking for? Musical ecosystem I spend the most time in.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. And you?
Well, I think I do really like what you said about the Grammys and their sort of classification of this as urban or rap, if I remember correctly. And
Urban, I think, is what they went with.
Right. And basically Tyler's pushback that it was pop. And, I definitely recognize that not only is this not what we traditionally saw as rap, and it's not something so easily pushed to the margins away from what is contemporary.
Yeah.
Hip hop itself is very contemporary. Probably the dominant or parallel dominant force in music, maybe next to traditional pop, like Taylor Swift style,
right?
Something. But even that, those borders are blurring as the production aesthetics of both worlds sort of converge together. So for me, I haven't an album like this I become familiar with through my sort of casual engagement with pop culture in general.
Right.
So, the Grammys, through watching the Grammys, through watching performances on American Music Awards or that kind of thing. I don't right now listen to terrestrial radio. So, it's not like I've got CFOX on all day.
Oh, yeah, me too. I don't listen. And I also don't watch the Grammys.
Well, I always made a point of watching the Grammys so I could feel really, sort of like butthurt about a lot of things.
Okay.
But for me, it's more sociological. It's one of the few venues left where I could maybe get a sense for not just what's happening in terms of how the Grammys present it, but also in terms of the juxtaposition of other people pushing back against that,
Right.
So, that sort of generates a lot of
right. It's like it's a sociological node.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect expression there. So, but for me, this album and this genre, I don't have a direct avenue to engagement with it because I don't have young people in my life that are feeding me this, me this these recommendations, or I'm not following their interests and sort of picking up the sort of crumbs of where things are going through them. And the album itself, although there are physical copies out there, the idea of an album is virtual, really. Right. And so, just that sort of distance from the physicality of something, which was how I dominantly used to listen to music and find music, was through, physical expedition.
Right.
I recognize that I don't have a doorway or a pathway that is sort of contemporaneously feeding me this kind of music,
Right.
In sort of real-time cultural relevance.
Okay.
It's always after the fact for me to find it.
Right. Okay.
So my exposure to this was equally through Josh's recommendation.
Right.
I knew of Tyler, the Creator.
Yeah.
And I probably saw, performances of his, specifically on award shows and
Right.
culture shows, that kind of stuff. I know of someone like Kendrick Lamar, and I've seen, again, some performances, but I've never pursued them independently as a musical sort of interest or thread that I had been going down.
Right. Yeah,
So-
but I think that what you're saying is intriguing because, like I said, I mean, I listen to lots of different types of music, and so I'm very open to listening to anything. And I think that when you are also someone who creates music, that is something that also informs what you go seeking and how you go looking for it. And that's one of the things I've really appreciated about the podcast, is where even before we put the mics on, I was talking about how, and I think I've mentioned it before, that the moment I start getting into any album that we've talked about, I'm immediately confronting what I don't know.
Yeah.
Even if it's something like Gretchen Goes to Nebraska, King's X, the last album we did, there were lots of things that I hadn't considered.
Yeah.
Lots of things that I didn't know about that I actually had to choose how much further down this particular information road do I want to go.
Sure.
And so an album like this, though, because I knew of Tyler, the Creator, but I didn't really delve into his work. Now that I have, I feel like it's opened some doors for me to explore. I just have to choose to make the time to do that, because we also live in a time now which is very different than what you and I were raised with, is that there's so much music that's available to us. There's so much. Whereas before, the not only how much, but how you would get access to it. Like you mentioned, the physicality of an album has changed.
Yeah, walking into a record store, and seeing everything that is current in release and being marketed.
Right. But what I love about what you set in motion with talking about how our familiarity with this form of music is that in listening to this album, if you look at how it's put together and what's in it, you're not talking about one type of music.
No.
You're not talking about a genre.
Yeah.
You are talking about
music.
A music, but you're also talking about somebody. And I think it's very important to also mention how this was self-produced by Tyler.
Yeah.
That you're talking about someone who has a vision and who's drawing from elements that they feel they require to interpenetrate, to cross-pollinate, and to create something that evokes how they're feeling, whatever that may be and whenever it may be. And so one thing about this album that I immediately found striking about it was how inspiring it is. I find this album to be inspiring because for a number of reasons, which we'll get into.
Yeah.
But on top of that, it inspires me to keep myself open to a wide, which I already do, but to keep myself open to the wide palette of music that is a part of the human endeavor.
Sure.
So, in as much as Deltron, our conversation about Deltron 30 took me down some very different avenues of music exploration, this album is going to do the same.
Right. I like what you said, and it reminds me, like when we spoke about our engagement with with the real, with our audience, and the engagement that we have with ourselves, sort of putting things on the table and getting very real with what comes from us in these discussions. One of the things that get us so excited about concept albums in general is that, for the most part, but not completely, but we are engaged with a creative entity. These are conceptualized products executed by somebody. Somebody had to conceive of this and then create it and put together. So that's, in the same way that just our podcast is trying to engage with real stuff, and our conversations are creative and come from a very personal part of ourselves. That's why we're here in the first place. That's so part of that excitement that you had just talked about was, we are engaging with this guy called Tyler, the creator, who put this amazing piece of art together. He conceived of it, he executed on it, and here it is. And it opens up, like all good art, doors that are beckoning and calling to us, and there's so many pathways to travel down with this, and that is part of that excitement. When we talk about Beethoven, the same thing comes up. Where we get excited about what Beethoven put together.
And it's funny that you're saying that right now, because on the way over here, I was thinking about what you initiated with this idea of how much time do you spend with hip hop, right? At least the question directed at me. And I just thought about, I've been studying Bach since I was 14, and I still don't think I know much. So, how much I think, for me, I know music, I tend to just default to, there's still more. I just go there. Yeah. So I would, even though I've been playing guitar almost my entire life, I still don't consider myself like a repository for all of the guitar knowledge that you could have. So when you first heard this album, it was when Josh suggested it to us. Yes. And what was your first impression of this album?
My first impression of this album was that it was hard. It was hard for me to get into it first. I threw the album on, put the headphones in, and let it play out. And there's vocabulary here, and aesthetics, and noise, and all kinds of elements to the production of this that were all competing and hitting me simultaneously. Yeah. And I was not orientated in it. So, I'm taking it sort of in real time, trying to sort of in real time sort of filter it through with what I know and what I don't know, and make sense of it all. And that process, although for some that's the point where they turn music off, right? It's like, oh, I don't get this, or I don't have the nodes preloaded to receive this as input. I don't even know it's what these inputs are. That will have some people definitely turn the dial or hit skip or pause. But that's the exciting part, right? It's like learning a language. both of us have traveled quite extensively and been exposed to lots of different languages. And when you touch down in a place to a brand new language, you can't distinguish words even, like, in sentences, right? It takes a while to orientate towards, sort of being able to pick out structure and sentence and individual words and sounds and it's that building familiarity with something as our creative brains are creative and organizing entities unto themselves. Like they're trying to make sense of this. And so that process of getting to know something that I'm completely unfamiliar with is something I've always really, really enjoyed. So I wasn't put off by the album.
Right.
I wasn't put off by the experience of like, what is this? What is going on here? I was sort of excited. So my first listen and my first few listens, probably 6 or 7 listens were about building that, those receptors, like priming them to, as my brain was organizing what I heard. Am I hearing a narrative? Am I hearing characters? Am I, what's the relationship between music and lyric here? And what's the overall arc of a particular song? What is a song on this? And what's the arc of the is there an overall narrative? All these things sort of coming at you while you're trying to deal with new vocabulary and new sounds, very, very, very exciting. And that puzzle of the brain, trying to bring that clarity into focus. And there was a point when suddenly it just sort of congealed into I got this. I've got some more. I've got some purchase with this. I've got my hand on. I'm steadied. And I'm suddenly taking it in. I'm suddenly getting the narrative. I'm suddenly getting the characters and recognizing what's happening here. And the vocabulary has become familiar. But up until then, it was very, very. The album hits hard, right? It doesn't come at you gentle.
No,
so so there's an information overload, especially for sort of new, without having preloaded those receptors or pre-primed the receptors to sort of receive it. So that was my experience when I first started playing this.
So you had to acclimatize to it, because I have, just as an aside, I've noticed that there are. In our conversations about first listens, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, but I get that it seems to me like we have this difference in our engagement with, I don't know if I would be so generous to say with music, but there's something about the cerebral part of taking in these works of art that I feel I hear you talk about going through. That's very interesting for me. And how I look at it partially is as you want answers, like you have questions or you have curiosity, and what I found really interesting about this album right away is he had me right off the bat because of that glorious 24 seconds of a synth pad. Yeah. Like I love that sound. Yeah. Like already I'm intrigued. What is this? Who is this? And where is it going to go? And what I found so interesting, I guess what I'm bringing up right now, I mean, maybe this is something we can explore in the Aftercast, but I'm curious to have a conversation with you about the visceral immediacy of feeling music. Sure. And then the stuff that our brains do. So I just wanted to kind of pop that in there. But
and I'll quickly respond to that. One thing is that I don't want you to think that I listen to this intellectualized like that. So I'm describing.
That's a good clarification.
Yeah, I'm describing in intellectualized vocabulary, an experience. But the experience of listening is always emotional for me.
Okay,
so
that's a good thing to clarify.
So I'm not listening with that sort of detached, problem solving.
Right.
How do I'm not looking for that kind of understanding.
Right.
I'm looking for feel good, but in the same way, I'm looking for the emotional experience.
Right.
But in the same way, an unfamiliar sound,
right.
has an effect, or you may struggle with processing. Is this a sound of joy? Is it a sound of danger? Is it a sound of pain or pleasure? Like what's this, like a big loud sound? What is that? The emotion that you're going to feel from that, there may be surprise or shock, but once that vocabulary sort of comes to you, your experience of that will sort of be a little different than just being new to it. So there's a couple of experiences here. There's that experience of new to this, right? Which would be boring. Because that would be my common experience to everything I was new to,
I get what you're saying.
Yeah. So
I think I just wanted to touch on it because
just in case, right? Yeah.
Well, no, I
just for clarity.
But I think also because we've been very honest about this podcast is partially about our developing relationship around music.
Sure.
And so, a few of the albums we've talked about, for me, I wasn't doing those things until I was way into having listened to it.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of acknowledging the differences in our approach and how we convey our experiences.
Yeah.
And I think with this album, it's very interesting to bring that up because this album just draws on so many different time periods.
Sure.
In the material that it uses, and there is very, very interesting and dynamic elements of timbre and movement and rhythm and structure. And so this album, to me, what immediately grabbed me after that synth was how emotional sonically this is. I watched a number of interviews with Tyler just to learn something about how did he put this together. And in one of the interviews, he talked about how it started. In this one interview, he said it started that he was waking up in the morning and he was feeling something. And so he started making music. And after a few mornings like that, he started to see this evolving process and a musical narrative about what he was genuinely going through with this love triangle.
Yeah.
Which is part of the concept of this album. So for me, I was just immediately, I didn't want to think. I didn't want to think because there's always cognition going on, but I wanted to just stay in the waters emotionally with this album because I really liked how it created a very dense texture emotionally overall. I mean, he's using a lot of different textures.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the reason why I was bringing that up.
Yeah. No. And good to bring up. I just don't want to get painted too much with it because, like I said, when I'm experiencing that first listen, I'm not actually articulating those thoughts like, what's going on here? I'm sort of retroactively describing what my brain was probably doing in automatically, unconsciously, right? So it's because of course I do that.
Well, that's part of our process.
Yeah, I've got to go back and explain to myself what my brain was doing.
Okay, and see, so that's a very valid insight.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with this album, the first thing that sonically was very striking to me was the use of synths.
Yeah.
And harmony, like the complexity of the chords and chord movement that was being used in it.
Yeah.
And also how the mixing is different. There is this really amazing aesthetic of the vocals and all the other sounds and instruments having a different mean volume in relationship to one another. So what you were saying earlier on about trying to, I can't remember the exact words, but like tease out what's going on. There's just a lot. Right. There's a great deal of sonic movement, of harmonic movement, and there's also a lot of space in places where you wouldn't normally or expect, the mind might not expect to find it. So I could see very, very much how there is like the thinking about it. Okay, why is this moving the way it is? But I found that there's such a consistent use of emotion, it seems, to make choices.
Yeah.
Instead of this logically goes here and then this logically goes here, which I'm sure there is.
Right.
But I just found that there was a lot of emotional steering of these tracks in the album.
I'm really interested in the fact that this story it's a love story, right? It's
on many levels.
On many levels, but a very common, very sort of foundational to our lived lives. I mean,
yes.
I think we both have our own versions of this story, in our past, perhaps.
We could start a podcast about unrequited love.
Yeah, unrequited love, and and heartbreak, and the various things that happen with that. Yeah, and so what I really liked was the fact that that this story was universal in that sense, and
yes.
and that's the being able to connect to that and being pulled into that meant that everything else aesthetically was just aesthetics, right? And a little salt, a little pepper, a little paprika, like you try a new spice, you'll get to it, but it's food, right? It's nourishment. It's sort of as commonly existential or human experiences as we share on the planet across every culture. So
right.
But it wasn't a vast, Lord of the Rings volume narrative of the love story. It was a fairly specific and brief time period of sort of a love story. If you just looked at it and tried to put some sort of temporal, timing to the we'll call it the events of the narrative.
Yes.
So I thought that was amazing, and I also really appreciated that it followed a very familiar structure, both in terms of storytelling. Sort of almost a 3-act structure, but also in terms of musical theater, in terms of rock opera, in terms of symphony, which we've talked about in the past. It starts out with Igor's theme, right?
Yes.
And Igor's theme is kind of like the overture.
Exactly.
And so, here's a simple story that is basically symphonic.
Yeah.
In
Which
structure.
actually, that first track was, up until the end, he had intended it to be instrumental. And then he said that this melody came into his head. And I believe the story is the person who actually sings the melody that you hear in that first track just kind of found words for the melody. And that's just how it happened.
Interesting.
It's very interesting, and in seeing interviews and listening to interviews with Tyler about the album, there's a lot of that. But I want to go back to just what you said about the structure, the overall structure, and the the commonalities of the structure of a narrative like this. Like I think it is a three act.
Yeah.
I think you can make it a 3 act. But what I found so amazing about this album, and again I go back to that thing I said about how emotional it is it's about 40 minutes.
Yeah.
But every time I listened to it, it felt like 3 times the length. And what I attribute that to is just the richness of what is here. And this is why maybe I'm getting to this sooner than would make sense in our conversation, but I find this album inspiring is because it seems to demonstrate that if you're really emotionally invested, you are going to not only reach other people or people who are in attunement with where you are, but you are going to make choices and decisions creatively that might not have a rhyme or reason. If like I said, it was 3 act,
Yeah.
but it doesn't feel like 3 act, and it feels like it's longer than it is, and it's not because it's boring.
No.
It's just because there's so much in the shot. It's like a Tarkovsky film where there's just so much in the frame.
Sure.
That if you pause the frame, you would look at it like a painting, and all these elements inform all the other elements. Or a Kurosawa, like I mentioned Kurosawa before, and having motion in the frame
Sure.
is like you're filming a film almost.
Yeah, yeah.
And so there are movements in modulation of chords, but then, and so like there's this, if you will, kind of like a left to right feeling of how music is moving through time. But because of some of those changes, but also just the overall textural construction, there's a depth that we don't often get with, well, as Tyler said, pop music. And I think that there is an emotional robustness that comes out sonically from this album. And when I, again, saw an interview with him, and he said the thing that matters to him most after saying chords, he said it's actually how everything sounds. So lyrical content will take a back seat to what things sound like. So when I learned that about him, I started to view his approach to creating music to be a lot more like world building, a lot more like, you mentioned symphonic.
Yeah.
There's a size and magnitude in theater. You also mentioned that too. His music is incredibly theatrical.
Yeah.
And so when I was listening to it, one of the associations I made, especially with all the vocal content that's in this, was Kate Bush, Hounds of Love.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the same theme. It's about love.
Yeah.
It takes a different path with it though. But I was feeling a lot of sonic theatrical, not only ornamentation but depth.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, one of the ways that it diverges from the 3 act structure, and I think that might be part of why you sort of experience this as beyond that or fuller than that, is that in typical Hollywood 3 act structure, it's neat and
Yes.
it wraps up.
Yes.
And it's over.
Yeah.
And we go back to our lives feeling, good
Yes.
about things, or
It's affirming.
or bad. Yeah, or cathartic, and if it's the flip side of comedy drama, but yeah. And what I found with this is that although it's 3 act in terms of sort of we'll call it structurally, that he grounds it in experience that we know. We don't live in 3 acts.
No.
Right? We don't. It doesn't end. Like
Right.
even when we resolve things, they don't resolve.
Did you notice the last note of the last track?
The last note.
And the relationship to the first note of the first track?
Tell me.
it's diatonically, harmonically classical of a 5-1. So the album actually will loop on itself musically in a conventional way.
So it's a cadence that sets up the beginning again.
It's right.
Yeah.
So it's in itself, it has its own embedded loop. Yeah.
I think that's a very neat observation, and it quite possibly could be instinctual, intentional.
I don't think Tyler realized it. I think someone else pointed it out to him.
Right, and he thought,
and he wrote back, that's
yeah, I meant to do that.
No,
yeah,
I don't know. Actually, I can't remember what his response was.
But that idea doesn't take away from the creativity of this, because part of what you talk about, where the lyrics followed first from the sound, all these things are emergent, right? Like one thing begets the other. So the lyric doesn't have to be the intent, and it's also not an afterthought. It's inspired by the feeling. It comes from the music, and so in that sense, the creative process it's really interesting to see how that is managed and how things do come together, because there's different ways to tell a story, right?
Yeah.
And you don't, as a creator, you don't have to always be sort of working from your outline or have your thing charted out or written out, as you're going through that creative process, and you're, experiencing and reliving experience and maybe reconstituting it, it inspires the creation of other elements within it, and they all converge to create this thing that we have.
Well, and to give a very tangible example of the album from what you just said, is Tyler also mentioned how there's moments where he's breathing in it. You can hear his breath. That was due to his asthma. And at first he was going to just pull it out, but then he left it in because he thought, no, this is happening. This is a part of me. It's a part of my voice. It's a part of my life. I imagine that's one way he might have looked at it. And you talk about, the cleanness of it. This album is so dirty. And in a very particular way, which I'm going to get to. Tyler earlier work was branded as horrorcore, which is a form of rap hip hop that uses, horror basically in a variety of ways. And when he was associated with that, apparently he said, no, I'm not a part of that scene. But I think in his earlier work, there is this edge. There is this darkness that comes at me. His first album was called Goblin. We have an album called Igor. I'm sure we're going to get to the symbolism of that. But when I was listening to this album, I was thinking about what he said about how he likes to hear harsh sounds harsh, and he likes to hear smooth sounds smooth.
Right.
And I think that's another thing that is exemplified in what you're talking about how this isn't a Hollywood three act. It's dirty, it's messy, it's got rough edges. And one of the things that I thought about when I heard him say that and I listened to the album, I thought about David Lynch's Blue Velvet.
Okay.
And for those of you who haven't seen Blue Velvet, it's a hard movie to watch because it's probably, in my estimation, one of the best examples of what David Lynch has done in terms of content and visually, which is to take very polarized elements and basically put them in a petri dish together and then see what happens. And in Blue Velvet, he's got these very, very vanilla, goody, two shoes kinds of protagonists, and then an adversary that is just a very, very unsavory psychopath, just dirt that you don't even want to even come close to imagining where it goes. And he puts these characters together in the same scene.
Yeah.
And and using nudity to even create more vulnerability, more discomfort, bringing characters very close together. But what happens is you don't see one really overtake the other. You see them amplify each other.
Yeah.
And then you get something that seems out of control, but it's being shown to you in something of a framed, controlled way. And that's how I feel a lot of this album plays out, is that he takes these harsh sounds, he takes these smooth sounds, but then how he brings them together, you don't get simple, kind of like a mathematical addition or subtraction or multiplication. You then get these elements that just come up that you wouldn't even think would be in the interplay of these other elements.
Yeah.
Like he does it with vocals. And I remember, I really appreciate what you said about how you first needed time to engage with this album, because I did too on a couple of levels. And one of the most pragmatic levels is where's Tyler's voice? Who is Tyler?
Who is Tyler these tracks?
It's amazing what he does with the vocals, because it's not like because it's a very common thing in hip hop to have friends and other artists come in and join in the creative act.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of symbolism in that in terms of community and creativity. But then there's also just I think how I look at it is that it's the inspiring piece. It's inspiring to work with your friends. It's inspiring to work with someone who can do something that you might not necessarily be great at.
Right.
And
they don't necessarily come in as other characters. They come in as another avatar for Tyler.
Yes. So this is the theater piece.
Yeah.
One of the theater pieces. And so for me, that bit about Blue Velvet and those marriages of the harsh and the smooth, he's doing it vocally. He's doing it with the synth patches. He's doing it with harmonic movement. He's doing it with the drum beats. He's doing it with found sounds that create extra texture in there.
Yeah.
There is nothing that is not on the table to be treated in this way.
Yeah, and for me, that was one of the things I had to put together. So it's almost a cliche to hear pops and record scratches and right. That sort of static background noise in rap, or in hip hop productions. And so when I heard that, I was hoping as this album was unfolding to me, I was hoping there was this wasn't just a mixed bag of pull-down menu production inputs, that I'm dropping into the track. I've been watching people compose and create, we'll call it beats in real time, and a lot of it is just grabbing from menus and dropping things in place. And you've got 500 samples of record pops and static noise, and so my initial sort of hesitation when I heard that was, I hope this isn't just one. I hope I'm not being set up for that. Okay. And of course, I wasn't. There is a real intentionality with that. Those are there to dirty up the sound, not because they're a trope. No. Now, is there a postmodern sort of ironic wink about, I know this is a trope, and on one level, I'm going to let you think it's a trope. On the other level, it's doing a job, and you're not even aware of it. So, is there multiple levels of engagement there from the creator to us? Maybe, right?
Well, I think that what I got a lot out of the interviews that I saw with Tyler is he's very intuitive. He very much goes by how he feels. So it's hard to say, I think, at times. But one piece to this album that I really thought was interesting that enabled structure was the presence of the comedian narrator. Dropping these little pieces of wisdom.
Right.
So there is, if I remember right, there's 5 of them.
Yeah, 4 or 5.
4 or 5 of them. And the first time that it happens, it's a track all its own.
Mm-hmm. Very short.
And then after that, every other time you hear this comedian who's got this kind of narrator kind of presence, it happens at the end of it. It happens at the beginning of a track, then it happens at the end of a couple of tracks, and then it happens in the middle of a track where two tracks are together.
Right.
And the way that the fact that it's a comedian not telling jokes and dropping like these life pieces of wisdom.
Right.
It's interesting what you're saying about these tropes. Like how do we know that there isn't that wink that you mentioned? What's the intentionality of these moments?
I mean, it's interesting because this goes back, and we saw something very similar in Deltron. Where we had these voices come in to punctuate and lay down some commentary that was either adjacent to the narrative or just seemed to give it a different push or sort of perspective to work with. That, of course, came out of a tradition in hip hop of skits and sort of these running commentaries on mixtapes and tracks.
Right.
But then that whole thing comes out of a much older tradition, going back to Greek drama and it's Greek chorus, it's narrator, it's that little voice to lay down a little something within the narrative that does serve a function, so that the tradition of that is tried and true, not just from hip hop, but it's a very common device.
Yeah, it is. But what I find interesting about it in this album is that it's a comedian.
Yeah, that's
it's not like someone coming from a position of academic or empirical authority. It's a comedian laying down, it sounds like this is what I've learned from living life.
Right.
And how those moments appear throughout the album. Again, it supports the 3-act idea.
Sure.
But then it makes it murky. Uh-huh. It doesn't keep what you said before. I think it clean.
Well, yeah, it doesn't tie it up either.
No,
right?
Exactly.
And I love the fact that that you bring up that it's a comedian, because that goes back to court, right? That goes back to your jester figure,
right,
or your harlequin that was just able to lay certain kind of, we'll call it angular truths,
right,
that were just sort of like that were perspective shifting and artfully not on the nose,
right,
but sort of resonated with. And now whether it was commentary on court life or commentary on drama,
right,
or that function, certainly as a comedian, has again a lot of precursors. It's you can follow it back to the Catskills, even very interesting that you would find that. And
it's got that, you mentioned the court jester, and that it has that function of challenging, but then also venting, but at the same time maybe dropping a seed for something that's going to grow later in awareness. So when he the first track that this narrator appears talking about chasing something, just the idea of chasing something, and immediately turns it into a paradox. And so this album, I think philosophically you could say, is not afraid of contradictions.
It affirms and contradicts at the same time, and it does present that paradox, often. It it problematizes, right?
How do you mean?
Well,
Open that up a bit.
It brings mess into things, right?
Yeah.
And we live mess.
And to bring it back to that opening synth, it isn't regular either in its LFOs. Like the LFO, which changes the texture and the quality of the sound. There's a couple of them on it, And so you're going to hear the same note, but that same note is moving.
Yeah.
That same note is fluctuating, it's sparking, it's smoothing itself out. And so even that opening sound, that first note carries so much of what the album is going to be, like you mentioned, in that way that an overture does that.
And to get that and to achieve that, you had to work the knobs, right?
Exactly.
And you're working the knobs. I had this conversation 2 days ago with a friend of mine when we were talking about synths and synth programming.
Yeah.
And, I don't have any hardware right now, synth hardware. So I'm, working on virtual stuff. And you don't play synth in the same way when you're like...
Yeah. There's a huge difference between the solid state and the digital.
And when your hands are on the knobs and you're feeling that, he wasn't on... That's not on the grid, right? He's not working that on the grid, and you can feel that. And at first, it was one of those things when I talked about orientating with what's going on, right?
Yeah.
My brain, I recognize that my brain, just like in music, is anticipating or looking for a cadence. It's looking for, for the measure to turn into the next measure. It's looking for those cues that are how we orientate within music to sort of, take us down the path. And I remember immediately sort of starting to try and anticipate where that synth was going and how it was just displaced both from the grid and from time. And it was breathing in a way I couldn't anticipate what the next note was and when it was going to trigger and how it was going to, it was, so it's something that was very, although analog, it sounds like a Moog or something, something.
Sounds moogie.
Yeah, moogie. Not.
That's my way of saying I'm sure and I'm not.
Yeah, that's right. I just want to
sound very Moog.
I want to make a joke about Moogie Hauser, but I can't think of the punchline or the
That's
setup
probably
for it. But
the best.
Yeah. So we'll circle back and see if any gold comes up for the Aftercast.
But I think you're right about that, and I like how you're bringing an awareness into those mechanics, because there's a few other musicians who I've had that conversation with too, where they have, for example, like a brute analog synth, which is not completely analog. It's got digital elements to it as well, but you work those knobs.
Oh man!
And it's no different than if you went to a tube amp and you were playing with the dirt or the volume on it, going from 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 7, it's not really stepwise incrementally that way with what happens sonically.
Yeah.
There's a lot of personality in just how you turn the dial a little bit.
Sure. Which
and
goes back into R&B and the Hammond organ. Why there was something so cool about the Hammond that wasn't just the organ, and the patch, it like they're working those levers, right, and they're turning those knobs, and I love when you connect to the performance element of a guy needing to feel it to do it, to lay it out, and
that's why I think it's important to point out that this album was produced by him. Because I think that position enables you to create the space to allow those emotions to run the show to a certain degree.
Right.
When you have that external individual, yes, they can be, of course, I'm not going to stigmatize producers as being all the same, because they're not.
Sure.
But just from what I got from Tyler talking about how the album occurred.
Yeah.
And to preserve that staying in the realm of emotion. And then when he's working with so many vocalists, Kanye's on this, CeeLo's on this, Pharrell's on it, you are, how I view it is that you have to help them into your emotional space.
Yeah.
And of course they're going to do things, but if you're coming from a place of emotion, it's very different than if you you told somebody, I want you to say these words just like this, versus you give them a melody and let them find the words.
Right. Well, and also, if the feeling is already, sort of peppered into the track, you're hoping to, elicit the response to that feeling. And, depending upon how seated that is in the track itself, that's going to be determined on what it elicits. So, now for me, I'm very curious about how this album was produced. And by that, I mean, I'm really curious and wish I could be in the room for 8 months or however, to watch the workflow and watch that creative process. I have some assumptions and I have snippets of information, but, I know how I create music and how bands create music that I've been in and the process there. I'm very curious because I definitely get a sense of that, but I really want to know more. I really want to be in the room.
Yeah, and I feel the same way.
Yeah.
There's a curiosity that arises with an album like this of how did it happen?
Yeah.
And if you watch someone explain to you and give you an analysis of what the result is, you're not talking about the same thing at all in my mind.
Yeah.
There was a really interesting moment in this interview Tyler did with Rick Rubin. And he talks about, I'm afraid I can't remember which track it was, but Tyler had come up with a chord progression and he didn't like it in terms of it didn't move where he wanted it to move. And so Rick Rubin said, well, can you play for us like what happened? So you hear Tyler go to the piano and he bangs off a much more conventional harmonic motion in the chords. And he uses a lot of seventh chords. There's lots of color.
Yeah.
And
especially on those vocals.
Yeah, very much so on the vocals. And he showed how he just added a couple chords that the harmonic motion didn't resolve so quickly, so easily, and it didn't resolve.
Right.
And so I think that one thing that came up for me with this album, as you mentioned, it happens in the vocals, but also just in the keyboard parts and the harmonies that happen in general, is that he not only has an ear for dense chords and voice leading. So voice leading is when you have, let's say you have a 4-note chord, and voice leading means how each one of those notes moves into being another chord.
Yeah.
He has an exceptional ear for that. But what I also find really interesting about this album, which is why I'd like to be a fly on the wall, is that he also messes around with intonation. It's not like everything's quite in tune the same way. And when you're working with samples, because there's quite a few samples on here, there's Run DMC, there's the last track uses Al Green, there's the OJs, there's a number of things. You're gonna find tunings that might be out of where you are. But I feel that there's a few moments where he's intentionally bending pitches.
There's a lot of micro pitch manipulation.
Yeah.
You can hear it. There's some Eventide magic happening, or whatever they're using to
or virtual
detune.
Eventide.
Yeah. It's a big. They got a bank of 3000s.
Yeah.
And again, it's not. You can hear the knob turn, right?
Yeah.
It's not. Oh, let's adjust the pitch. It's detuning in a dynamic way.
Yeah.
Right?
So out of listening to this album, again, I go back to the inspiring piece, is that I feel that I get from Tyler that he has a very, I don't want to say a sensitive ear, but he has a very robust, dynamic ear, which not only informs the fundamental scope of his palette, but what he will do with that palette.
Yeah.
How he will maybe, like you said, pitch tune, change the pitch on this a little bit, or even how he will, there's a few lines where I love how comedy comes out for him, where there's a lyric about how someone's feeling, and it's sung really beautifully, and then you just hear this, it's like a popped in, I'll be fine.
Yeah.
And it's just in this spoken, quick, in and out kind of voice.
Little aside.
Just a little aside, but it's in the movement of the music.
Yeah.
And that is another thing about his work that I really appreciate, is that he's able to use all of these bits and pieces or all these elements, and the momentum of the music is so sustained.
Well, if the narrative itself, if we want to use musical terms to describe it, the narrative is polyphonic, right?
Yes.
So, and it's also polyphonic in a way that is adding color, right? And so it is following harmonic structure in narrative form. So you're getting a narration that's the seventh.
But
right?
would you say, so how does the emotional piece come in? Because when you use the word narration, at least for me, there is something very cerebral about that, and it's very much about words, spoken words.
Yeah, and that's...
So are you talking about a sonic narration?
Well,
or an emotional narration?
The effect of it is a sonic narration, but through just the lyric content, So he's the lyrics themselves are their own, following a polyphonic structure, right?
Yeah.
So you've got, lyrical content that is stacking colors in the same way harmonic content is stacking colors. So and so you're achieving the same effect on the narrative or lyrical front that you are on the chordal front and the musical front. So so when you look at all these different voices in there, you can kind of pick the color tones, and if especially if you are if you already associate music and harmonic differences in music with colors.
Synesthesia.
Synesthesia. You can try and apply that to the narrative, to the lyric in the same way, and see if you get if the colors converge. If the two converge, or if they don't. There's a poetic there, but the language is harmony. Right.
Yeah, and I would say that he's definitely a sonic poet.
Yeah.
Right? Any word is a multi-dimensional entity. Mm-hmm. It can be a lot of different things. It can become a lot of different things. And no one word carries the weight of all the other words.
Right.
So there's a spirit of 20th century composition about his work in that world of, well, anything goes, right? So what's the cohesion of anything goes? Well, for this album, it's where he was emotionally.
Yeah.
And that's why I find that what you said earlier was very, very important about how it's a story in its simplicity that so many people can identify with.
Yeah.
So, and that story is kept very simple. And that's why I felt listening to this album was that I was just really journeying through the nuances and the affability and ineffability of emotions. Mm-hmm. Right? So the fact that the love triangle in itself, that has the broadest reach. Yeah. Actually, no, unrequited love has the broadest reach.
Yeah.
And then the love triangle has a large reach. But then when you start to look at how it's about his love for another man who's in love with another woman, mm-hmm. that kind of turns it into another type of sociological or cultural demographic. Mm-hmm. But emotionally, to me anyways, and sonically, none of those particular issues really can keep up with the scope of the love piece and the emotions that he's exploring, because unrequited love requires you, an individual, to be in the embrace of your own sense of love. So unrequited love is actually not unrequited love.
Right.
It can't, obviously there's that, but there's also the piece about how do you feel about yourself? And
Well, and we know.
do we?
Well,
Igor? let's maybe, do we have time? The whole Igor personality is, there's got a lot of layers to that.
Absolutely. And I'm, I think it's important to recognize at this point in the conversation that, this album obviously has an enormous complexity, and there is so much that we can discuss with this, and we'll be able to continue that in the Aftercast as well. A lot of folks, when they're talking about concept albums, they want the quick and dirty. So it's an give me the quick summation and give me the characters and let's put this to bed kind of thing. And so as we start to unfold these things in conversation, we're following certain trains, and we're aware in real time certain paths that we haven't opened up yet, or we haven't quite gotten down yet. And so for anyone that is listening to that, this is just the organic nature of a conversation. We've got so many roads we can travel on. Igor's a big one. Oh, yeah. And the album's called Igor, but for a brief mention of Igor's theme as a title, it's the first time we've even mentioned the name, in this conversation. And we're probably like an hour and 10 minutes into it or something.
Oh, you're pretty close.
Yeah. So, So bear with us. We'll get there if not in this, in the Aftercast. But, but like all good art and like all good things, you can keep talking about this album and keep experiencing this album as things sort of.
But and to continue that bit about the love piece, and unrequited and one's own sense of love. That's why I think whether it was intentional or not, it's very interesting that the very, very bread and butter of conventional harmonic movement makes this album a self-perpetuating loop. The last track harmonically asks to go to the beginning of the album again, and it picks it right up. So there's a feeling about how, for me, with the just the basic theme of love and sense of self, that's just going to go on and on and on, and which takes us back to what we were saying before about how it is a 3-act, but it isn't. It's messy. And I think that most writers will tell you that a 3-act is just a guide to help you. There's different ways that you can approach it.
But and to be fair, most Hollywood movies, or most movies that are trying for a 3-act, all fall apart in the 3rd act anyway. And so there's 2 acts and then an unrealized 3rd act that, not for art's sake, but just for either laziness or like they couldn't do it.
Well, I mean, but in terms of this album and this theme of love, are you really ever done with that? Like, is there a bow on love that you can just say, there it is? And in the album, the way he will talk about the other person,
right?
And then there'll be attacks. There'll be these stinging little moments, but then he will soften it later.
Right.
It depends on where you are in the story.
Yeah, I mean, psychologically, there's some really, really interesting things going on here that speak to the human condition. Total cliched phrase there. Sorry about that, but they really
we have to have one. Per episode.
At least one every 5 seconds. When I'm talking, I'll save some of that psychological exploration for the Aftercast. What I found really interesting about what you just said, and you said it a little bit earlier when you talked about the love triangle and the woman in the love triangle, and you sort of in passing touched on we'll call it a male female thing, and this to me is so Greek in that classic idea of male idealized male relationship, idealized male love. I found it really interesting that I thought that the women characters in this were incidental to a certain kind of love, as sort of, I don't want to say posited, but a certain kind of love that was being sort of conceptualized by Tyler's character, that may or may not be even what he was looking for anyway. I think for me, the story is a bit more of a mask. I think there's an element of Memento. Remember the film Memento? This, right?
Yes.
Right. So
that goes right to the loop.
Right.
That's totally the loop.
I'm not so sure Tyler is actually looking to set up house anywhere,
Right.
and I think this is a loop, and I think it goes through its loop, and it sort of sets up for a repeat with the shift.
Right.
And I think it's going to start all over again.
So you're talking about his own processes with love, or are you talking about?
Yeah, I'm talking about the character in this story. That I think this story actually explores more the characters. The characters pursuing love in the same way that character in Memento is pursuing the problem that's in front of him.
Yeah.
Right. And
keeps forgetting.
Yeah.
Has to remember.
Yeah.
And has all these little talismans and icons to bring it back in time.
Sure.
Yeah.
And but I think this is that character is fated to repeat that cycle because he's not actually looking for love.
Okay.
Like I don't.
Yeah.
I think his own discomfort with whether it's gay love or love period, like relationship period,
right.
whatever love represents as an ideal for him, we know that Igor persona that's in him is there already. It's not a product of this
right.
unrequited narrative.
Right.
And so, as he is pursuing his pursuing love or going through this trial, unrequited process.
Yeah.
And Igor is being activated and triggered, and while he tries to resolve or reconcile himself through this process, that I think what we're witnessing is sort of a very, I don't want to say broken, but we're a very complex self
Right.
journey here. I'm losing words to describe it. Let me just say there's just something much darker, I think, going on psychologically for this narrator than just what's being presented as the story.
And as you've brought it up a couple of times, what is a reliable narrator?
Right, in other episodes,
in other episodes, like Deltron 3030 is the first one that comes to mind. Is you wonder, and we have that already with this idea that there's Igor, and then there's costume, and that there is a persona that goes along with this album, and what is the function of that?
Yeah. And there's also shadow, right? And and Igor can be shadow, but I also see it distinct from shadow as well. So
which is something that's going to take time to open up.
Yeah, which is not going to happen right now.
But I think not to necessarily simplify it, but to take it in maybe a less thicker vein. of discussion is that I think what you're alluding to is that conceptually, lyrically, and musically, there's a consistency of ambiguity.
Yeah.
And that ambiguity serves us so well on so many levels. And if we choose to, it actually causes us to stop and say, wait a minute.
Right.
What is actually going on here? Like, what is actually the story? And the bit about you said about the dark aspect was exactly why Blue Velvet came to mind.
Yeah.
Because in his earlier work, there is a much more potent consistency of this dark approach. And actually, his album before this one, Flower Boy, he was accused by critics and some other people that he'd gone soft. And I did find in one interview he kind of felt challenged by that.
Yeah, well,
So then there's also that there's that other part about, which I think you can do with anyone's creative work, is what are the motivations that are here?
sure. I think it's important to note though that Tyler and his collective that he started out with, these guys were kids.
Yeah.
They were 16 and 17 years old.
Yeah.
Horrorcore, if you want to ascribe that as a descriptor to what they produced, is really the product of he hadn't had these experiences yet, right?
Right.
So the kids are going to pull from the obvious and from the and in their creativity, the creativity was there, but I'm less interested in the creativity part of horrorcore. I find that and the product of horrorcore, and find it more sort of a juvenile
Shock.
yeah, they had the swatches of of what you would expect a young kid to pull from. Like if you've got nieces and nephews, they're all watching horror movies at 15 and 16, and like, so that pastiche, I think is a juvenile pastiche, but the creativity was there.
Right.
But they developed a reputation as producers and as artistic follow through at such a young age that it's only until we get into these albums when they're in their sort of 20s, early and mid 20s, and you start to get not circumstantial complexity to do with like the sort of like the complications of living their lives within their neighborhood or their culture or within their community, but you're getting these more universal things that take time to get to in life.
Right.
So love, and not to say that a 15-year-old kid doesn't have love, but he doesn't have the same perspective on it.
So would it be fair to say that what you're talking about is that this album doesn't reflect his wisdom, but it reflects a place where he is still in early stages of his development as a person? I mean, I know this. I mean, it's kind of it's incredibly simplistic, but I'm trying to get to, because what I hear what you're saying is that part of the reason why we can't maybe completely rely on him as the narrator is because there are more life experiences that he needs to really get a broader outlook on this experience that he's actually drawing from.
Well, you make a good point, because the point you're making there is that there's.
I wasn't trying to make a point.
No, you made a good point, because here's the point that you made. I'm telling you.
Wow.
Joël has made this point.
Oh, the gloves are off.
But not only is there the unreliable narrator that is baked into the track as the character, right? But Tyler himself, like the artist is at times unintentionally, or the unreliable narrator of of the work of art itself. And so if you're speaking to the fact that some of that ambiguity was less intentionality and more just a product of his own, sort of like stage of journey with stuff, and he's in a journey where things are ambiguous and things are complex that way, I would agree. But I wouldn't want to diminish the truth of his experience, though.
No, that's not what I'm saying. Yeah. I'm just trying to find ways to reframe what you're saying.
Okay, yeah.
Partially because you said you were having trouble finding words.
Yeah,
so I'm just trying
okay.
to...
You're helping to help me find...
I'm trying to help all of us.
Yeah.
Well, and not that you need help, but I'm just trying to orient myself...
Right, with what I'm saying.
In the mixture of what we're talking about, because...
But I did take that as a very interesting sort of like point of delineation there. That there's different levels and of unreliability within the narrative, and some of those are artistic and intentional, and some of them are the character itself, and then some of them are the Tyler as the creator. I don't know.
And that's the beauty. One of the beautiful things about not just this album, but I think creativity at large. I think that, this is a huge sweeping generalization, but it seems to me that people default to creativity having this very particular source of initiation,
right?
And then cultivation, and then a high degree of directionality of expression. So what I mean by that is, for me, creativity it's not really up to me, right? And we've talked about being co-creative.
Yeah.
So I think that part of what I'm getting from what you're saying is it's not alluding. It's definitely pointing at this very question of creativity itself. Where is it? What is it? What is its function? What do we do with it?
Right.
How do we work with it? How do we use it to inspire one another?
People tend to want to ascribe sageness to the creator, right?
Yes.
Or they want to describe intentionality and savantness to someone like Tyler. In the same way, when we looked at King's X and why we loved Gretchen Goes to Nebraska, say compared to something, and I threw out Stryper as comparison, it was precisely the fact that they didn't have the answer. Right? Tyler's not telling us the answer. He doesn't know. He doesn't know for himself. He's sharing an experience.
Because at the end, he's asking, can we still be friends? What does that mean?
Yeah.
What does that mean to Tyler is one way to look at it, but in the human endeavor, what does it mean for us in general? Like, why is it that when we have experiences that are so gut-wrenchingly painful, we don't feel gratitude for the people involved because we learned something? Why is that? And so that very question he has at the end, can we still be friends?
Right.
Is like is kind of an admission that I don't have the answers. But I'd like to know what they are, and I'd like things to be a certain way, but they can't be. I mean, think about how the song that he uses is Al Green's Dream.
Yeah.
It's talking about dreaming.
Love that, by the way. Can we still be friends? Is it a question?
Yeah.
Or is it a request?
Yes.
Yeah. Right? Is it a question to self or a question to an external party?
The cosmos.
Yeah.
Is this is this phenomenologically possible? Is it emotionally possible? Yeah. And how he's that last track sounds like we have the overture of that synth patch.
Yeah.
But that last track is like the R&B closing of the curtain of a show. But what is it closing the curtain on?
Yeah. Yeah. And still be. still be presupposes you were friends.
Yeah.
Were you friends?
Yeah.
Do you know what, like,
What is friendship?
What is friendship?
Yes.
Right? I mean, like just that question alone
Can we?
is an amazing, it's huge. It's huge.
And I like how you've steered us into some of that in the way that we've gone into it, because this is not criticizing what he's done.
No.
It's like, it feels very much like it's, well, a supportive questioning, right? Because I don't know how many exes you have. And I'm not going to list how many exes I have. But I'm not friends with all of them. But I do know that the ones that I'm not friends with, if I think about it, how could we be friends? I've often thought about, who am I really asking that question to? Am I asking it of them, of us, or myself?
Yeah.
Am I the one who's impeding the friendship? Am I the one who's not really in tune with another aspect of myself or that other person, where the friendship's already there? It's actually probably going on and I don't even know it, in a sense. So what you've said about Tyler's age and his experiences in life, and then how the album depicts such a sonic, visceral exploration emotionally, that it makes sense that there's a lot of odd chord movement. It makes sense that things are out of tune. It makes sense that the dirty noises are dirty and the smooth noises are smooth.
Right.
And it comes back to that concept of love, and where some people will talk about how self-love is the most important thing, but then there are others who'll say, no, that's a misconceived idea. Because if you are very concerned with self-love, that's pride in a negative sense. That's ego in a self-destructive sense. But if you are love, that's not the same thing. So when he says, can we still be friends? It, as you said, I mean, it brings up very direct things about friendship, but I think it also kind of just lightly touches at the deep depth of love itself. Because in the last episode, King's X, I talked about this idea of the brotherhood of creation, and how their Gretchen Goes to Nebraska just feels to me like an album of companionship.
Yeah, I love that still.
And so when I said this album was inspiring, it wasn't because I feel a companionship out of this album.
No.
Because in a way, I feel that this album is trying to figure stuff out. This album is engaging with life and trying to somehow not define it, but mine meaning from it and mine understanding from it. But at the same time, like you said, we don't really get to, pulling gold out of the earth from this.
No.
Yeah. It's very interesting.
Well, for me, I love art, and I love art that helps me, or or finds a connection to how I sort of see the complexity of and the contradictions of lived experience. Like art helps reconcile me to that, and I feel closer to experience as it becomes grayer, as it becomes more complicated, as it starts to contradict.
You remind me of how I can't quote literally. James Baldwin talked about the reason why art is so important is because it constantly reminds us of how there is no security. Politicians can't do that. Doctors can't do that. Like in what he was saying was that it's the artists who say, look, there is no solid ground beneath you. You have to reconcile with that.
Right.
And so what I feel that, we've touched on a bit here is that whether that was literally what Tyler, the creator, was trying to do or not, I don't know. But I think that he achieved it in ways that our words, they're not for words. They're like, remember we've talked about this a couple of times about how there's concept albums that have these instrumental moments. We did a vignette about Iron Maiden's Power Slave.
Yeah.
And just, is it a concept album or not? And I start off by taking it so far as to say that the instrumental could convey something in line with all these other themes of power in all the other tracks. And then you very beautifully chimed in and said, sure, but does it have to? And you're right. Like when there's instrumental moments on a concept album, they have the capacity, in one way of thinking about it, to touch on the access to the ineffable that we already have, but our minds push back against.
Yeah.
And what I think Tyler has done, whether it's intentional or not, is he's made that happen in the tracks themselves with the lyrics happening at the same time.
Yeah.
There's a constant feeling of emotional legitimacy without the mind defining it.
Yeah.
I want to feel this.
Well, you said it doesn't matter what Tyler intended or if he intended something. And absolutely. We're not in any way looking for gurus. I don't want a guru. I don't want someone telling me the answer. It's why I couldn't give a toss what Kanye says. And I think when Kanye is trying to tell me something, I think he actually denigrates or hurts his art. His art stands on its own, whatever it is.
So you're okay with his contribution on this album?
Am I okay with this contribution? Yeah, I'm fine with this contribution. This is a no Kenny G zone. It's not a no Kanye zone. But I don't know Kanye very well. It's immaterial what Kanye or Tyler actually say after the fact or what they intended necessary with the track. As a piece of art, it's up for me to engage with it and for it to become a part of whatever I'm going to do with it as an experience.
Right.
And how I reconcile that to my own lived lives and my own conception of it. I'm wonderfully glad to have this as another element of that, from a place I didn't expect or I didn't know I would find it. Not that I had an expectation, but this is great. I didn't know that this was the story, and I didn't know that these themes were going to engage me the way they did, and I'm all the better for it, and I'm still engaged by it.
Yeah. And then that it would be a part of this season's canon.
No, there we go. And what a season, man. What a season so far.
Yeah. This has been great conversation, and I'm looking forward to heading into the Aftercast where we go places that, even we're not sure where we're going to end up.
Yeah, and you're welcome to come along with us. Obviously, your access to that will be through our Patreon account that you can find by searching Sonic Ventures Podcast on Patreon.
That's right. And if you do so, you also have the opportunity to actually suggest an album or albums you think we ought to talk about when we get to next season. Absolutely. And it's been a pleasure so far this season. We're just about wrapped up. We got one more episode that we'll be doing. And I'm very pleased with how things have played out so far. Yeah.
And thank you, Joël, for
Thank you, and thanks, Josh, for recommending Igor.
Absolutely, thank you, Josh, and we'll get more. We'll jump deeper in the Aftercast. But thanks for sure. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, me as well.
Cheers.